Hello, this is Kyle, also known as Alien Tube. Today, taking a look at this big boy from LK Chen. This is their military Dadao, and it sells new on their website for $230 plus $70 shipping to the US. Kult of Athena sometimes has these in stock at $268, but then you have to account for shipping and tax from them if your state has sales tax. So those are roughly similar prices. I will put a link to both in the description. Now, like I said, this is a big boy. It is a broad blade with a long hilt, long ring. The proportions on this are big. Now, it doesn't have a long blade, but it's long enough to get the job done. So at $230 to $300, let's call it $300, this is firmly in the budget range, which most of LK Chen's offerings are. This is definitely one of their lower cost offerings, though. So it is probably pretty attractive to people who just want to get a sword at a low cost, but they know that it is quality. And LK Chen has a reputation for good quality, and I would say a well-deserved reputation for good quality. Let's take a look at the individual pieces of this sword. It has a ring pommel, which has just a rough forge finish texture to it. It's got a wood core grip with a cord wrap on it. I'm guessing this is cotton. It feels generally like cotton. Now this sword was loaned to me by LK Chen. It's the last one of a box they sent me that I'm going to end up sending back to them pretty soon. I'm glad to be having these done. I'm sorry, KK, it should not have taken me this long to do them. Regardless, these swords have been shipped around to a number of reviewers and people to give their impressions, all that kind of thing. And due to that, there are some flaws on it. You know, when a sword passes through multiple hands, when it's been shipped a bunch of times, things start to get loose. Maybe a little maintenance wasn't fully kept up on. So the cord wrap here is a little bit loose. It's more loose right here. But I never had a problem when holding it and never felt like it was loose. In addition, there's some patina in a few different spots on the blade. But overall, this is probably the sword that has survived the best, all the shipping in particular, that really does wreak havoc on swords. And that's probably because this is also a very simple sword. Going back to the design, so it's got a flat grip that has a little bit of rounding here and that cord on here, and it gives a super effective grip. I can't twist the sword in my hand really at all. It's a very easy sword to grip, and edge alignment is very good with this design. This is very simple, but very effective. It's got a small brass or bronze guard. I believe this is patterned after snails. Don't quote me on that. It does a great job of stopping the hand from sliding up the grip. And I guess you could do a little bit of protection of your hand if you're blocking with the spine. If the opponent's sword comes down, this will at least slow it down, stop it. It gives some protection, but not a lot. And that's actually pretty common on a lot of Chinese swords. They tend to have relatively small guards on them. And then we get to the blade. Big and broad. Like I said, it has a double fuller in it. Both of these fullers are quite narrow. They're not doing a whole lot to reduce weight here. They're honestly, I would be tempted to call them more decorative than anything else because they are very shallow and they are very narrow. So there's not much metal being removed here at all. But they do look nice. They run pretty parallel. The ends are a little sloppy termination, but at a budget sword, that's not a big deal. It's got one smooth bevel from the spine all the way to the edge, and it does apple seed very nicely in about the last third of the blade. So there's a good amount of niku, if you want to use that Japanese term here, giving this a robust edge. But with the wide blade, it's a very effective edge for cutting. Now, if you just look at this sword in profile, you might think that it is incredibly simple and there's really not much nuance to it. because it looks basic, right? But if you look at it at the spine, you can see it starts quite thick and then tapers. It doesn't have a crazy amount of distal taper, but it definitely tapers in thickness throughout, which really helps keep it from feeling overly heavy and overly chunky. And to give a contrast to that, I have here a sword that I think is pretty clearly inspired by this type of sword. This is a Scorpion Swords blade, and I didn't buy this. I don't know how much it costs, probably $200 to $300, somewhere around there. It was sent to me by a friend. But these two blades are relatively similar, but the Dadao is much longer of a blade, and yet this sword weighs 1 ounce more than this sword. This is 2 pounds 12 ounces, 2 pounds 13 ounces. And this sword feels much heavier than the Dadao. Why is that? Well, first off, look at the grind profile. On the Dadao, it's one smooth grind from the spine to the edge, like I said. On the Scorpion Swords, the primary bevel starts right about there, just the last ½ inch or so. It is flat steel otherwise, so it stays the same thickness at the spine all the way to the primary bevel. That's a lot of weight to hold in the blade. In addition, look at the distal taper. You have I don't know how long you'll be able to pick this up, but there's a good amount of distal taper in the Dadao and absolutely zero in the Scorpion Swords. And that leads this to feeling heavy and clunky, whereas this sword, while not light, feels and moves the way a sword should feel and move. This is a much better sword at a relatively similar price to this. Now, since I was just comparing this sword to one that isn't really historical at all, it's definitely more on the fantasy side, let's rein back that and talk about the history where this sword came from. As always, when I'm doing these LK Chen reviews, let's cut to my friend Delatrix to discuss that.
And as always, Kyle, thank you so much for having me on. Now, what do I have in my hands? Believe it or not, this is a Dadao. How could that be? Well, let's get into what the name means. So the name Dadao is composed of two characters. Da, meaning big, and Dao, meaning saber or knife or sometimes just sword, but basically single-edged blade in Chinese. And so it's a name that goes back a long way. And so we see it at least as far back as places like the Ming Dynasty and probably even earlier. And it's a bit of a catch-all term. So used back that far, it referred to any of the larger types of saber, including things like polearms. So a sword like this that can accommodate two hands on it and has a single-edged blade would have been considered a da dao, not just a simple single-handed dao, but a really big dao that's imposing in presence. And as a result, it's a bit of a catch-all term, and it could have been a catch-all term, especially when referred to in military manuals. So think of it like referring to riflemen. If you say that you have a whole unit of riflemen over there, that doesn't tell you if they're carrying M1 Grands or Kalashnikovs. It's just saying they have the rifle category of weapon. Same thing with Dadao. Now, we go all the way forward in time to the end of the Qing, and the military is going through all sorts of reformations, and you end up with most of the Chinese style weapons going away from the military. They start modernizing, they start using more European style guns. They start switching from Chinese style sabers and start switching over to European style sabers. However, the country is fractured. There's all sorts of rebellions going on. It starts to be split into the warlord time period. So you have all of these little uh, warlords who are carving up parts of China and controlling parts of China. And in this period, swords are still being used both to terrorize, to maintain protection if you're trying to travel from point A to point B on a caravan or what have you, and also to enforce local control either as a result of the warlord and his bosses or the local police forces. And again, there were multiple police forces. Sometimes a single city could have multiple police forces active at a time. And in this period, the Dadao, as we think of it, was used as a means of kind of law enforcement. So the law enforcement would go out, they'd have some guns, and they'd have guys with the big swords strapped to their backs. And if they found someone who wasn't doing what they were supposed to do, they would execute them on the spot after a short trial. So it was a very visible sword in this period. The local authority would assert itself by way of this sword. This sword also goes by the name of kandao, or cleaving saber. So that's another term that might be more specific to the sword that we are more familiar with. And where does the design come from? So in some ways, it's a kind of the spiritual successor of this earlier Song era um, uh, Dao, this cleaving Dao. We're not exactly sure where it comes from. It's an interesting combination of features. It has a ring pommel usually on it. It has one of several types of guards. Sometimes there's an S guard on it. Sometimes you can find a disc guard on it. Very often you'll find the snail style guard, as is being reproduced on this LK Chen example. But almost always there's a kind of medium sized, curved, clip pointed blade on it. And it has a long enough grip that can be used either comfortably in one hand or with two hands on it. This allows it to be used even by people who have very little training. So if you need to raise, for instance, a militia group that's just an ad hoc group to defend the town against banditry or what have you, and they may not have a lot of proficiency in formal fencing, they've never practiced with a jian or what have you, but they've spent a lot of time using farm equipment, that have practiced using a hoe or a mattock or an axe, and they can have a lot of confidence with two hands on a weapon. That adapts very easily to the two-handed grip on the kandao. Whereas the nimbleness of it still allows it to be adapted to a swordsman who knows what they're doing. This gives it a very low entry to start using the sword, but allows it to be adapted and have a very high ceiling if you want to continue to practice and become proficient with it. And this continued to be used in martial arts long after the warlord period. So during World War II, it was deployed with soldiers. It became famous for certain exploits during World War II against the Japanese. After World War II, it became continued to become popular among martial arts groups, and as a result, it is ingrained in the pop culture as a very 20th century sort of Chinese sword design, even though it's probably started off originally as a means of enforcing the local populace and keeping them in check during the late Qing period. But it's a beautiful sword. It's very powerful, very effective. Let's see what Kyle can come up with for us.
Thank you as always, Andy. And as one of those people who does not have any training, who is a novice in this type of sword, I can definitely echo that this sword is easy to use in two hands. It is intuitive, it moves well, it pivots. I can move this around very easily without really any idea of what I'm doing with it. I am certainly not a Chinese fencer. I don't know any Daofa. I am not trained in this at all. But boy, does it move well. And boy, does it cut well. I took this into the backyard and did my normal targets on it. Water bottles and some variety of different types of plastic and paper containers. And this sword delivered clean, easy cuts with almost no effort. In fact, I was so impressed with how well this sword cuts that I started slowing my cuts down more and more just to see if it would get through. And the sword just didn't let me down. I slowed some of these cuts way down, and it just went through with no problem at all. That's a testament both to the sharpness of the sword, which is excellent, and the geometry of the sword with such a wide blade with one smooth primary bevel with a apple-seated edge. It is very conducive to getting very clean cuts because the actual angle at the edge is so acute. It is really well designed to be an excellent cutting sword. One thing I haven't mentioned so far is that it does come with a leather sheath. And if you look at some of the pictures that Andy shared, you can see sheaths that looked pretty much just like this. So while I don't like this sheath, it's leather. Frankly, it feels cheap. It frankly looks pretty cheap, but it's historic. And that makes sense. That's why LK Chen went with this. So this is perfectly fine for carrying the sword. I wouldn't want to store it long term in here because leather is not the best material. I think there might actually be a lining in here. Yeah, there's a lining in here that actually feels like a kind of cloth, which is going to probably protect the blade a little bit better than the leather, but it's still not a great material for long-term storage. All right, so this sword retails for approximately $300 once you account for shipping, tax, all that stuff. Is it worth that price? Yes, absolutely. This is actually one of the best cutting swords that LK Chen sent me. In fact, I think this is probably the best cutting sword. It is a ton of fun to cut with. And it is also, as Andy alluded to, a sword that you can use in modern style of martial arts if you happen to study this type of martial art. Now, there's not a lot of features here. This is a relatively simple sword, but it's executed extremely well. And that, to me, is worth $300. And that's going to wrap up this video. Once again, a huge thank you to KK for sending me these swords, and thank you for watching. Until next time, Alien Toot out.